Okay, I'm still in my Syd Barrett coat, which I'm calling this the multicolored coat of Joseph and Syd Barrett, as you know. So having looked at the Syd Barrett albums, I just want to go on away from the Cow album, which we've done, away from Metal and the transition album Obscured by Clouds, to probably the most popular album of all time. So let's not beat around the bush here. That's the nice, the prism on the front. This is a reissue. I do have an older version, but I'm just for clarity's sake. So I think everyone's seen this multiple times. Lyrics printed on the inside. And again, 73, and I'm also going to look at Wish You Were Here that came out directly after it. So again, what can I possibly add to Dark Side of the Moon? Maybe something, but we're going to look at just the period before that. So they recorded the soundtrack album Obscured by Clouds, which I highly recommended. Recorded it in 2 weeks. Then they spent a long time recording Dark Side of the Moon. Roger Waters talks about the fact that they were just jamming in E minor to C, I think it is, or E minor to G, which is the chords of Breathe, for a long time, and no one was really doing anything but jamming. But Waters had plans. The diligent, workaholic Protestant work ethic, getting in there, planning, while Gilmour was just tossing off E minor to C endlessly, and Rick Wright, starting to get coked out of his head around that time, also just jamming. But hey, what's wrong with jamming? Waters wanted work. So when you go to the studio, you work. So no jamming. So they're in Abbey Road too. Costs a bit of money. So they wanted to come up with something more than E minor to C or E minor to G. So, and they'd done this album very quickly in 2 weeks. But obviously, why was Dark Side of the Moon the one that broke them? Because before that, they'd been very much still a popular band. Adam Hart Mother went to #1. And Pipe at the Gates of Dawn created a big stir. So why were they why did they break through to FM radio in America and have this huge, massive following with Dark Side of the Moon? There's so many factors to it, but one, let's look at the artwork. That pretty rudimentary picture of them in black and white that ends up on Metal. Not good. Not good for anyone. Not good for record sales. Not good for the girlfriends of the band. They looked pretty ordinary there. So they decided not to have their faces anywhere on this album. And this is they all agreed and picked up this artwork, Hypnosis. And it's very distinct. So if you see that in a record shop, #1, we're looking at it from an Adorno's perspective. Why is this commercially successful? And their other albums previously weren't in America anyway. So, of course, the concept album. Bloody hell, is there a day in the life of Roger Waters when he's not trying to turn everything into a concept album? Probably not. So, Roger Waters, Mr. Concept Album. And if you want to listen to some difficult concept albums, check out Radio Chaos and Pros and Cons, but we'll work our way up to them. So, So at the time, definitely not something that Pink Floyd were renowned for. You can think, well, do some of the early albums have a concept to them? Not really. Adam Hart Mother had a cow, and they broke down the Adam Hart Mother suite into Funky Dung and Milky Milk and different little things, but that was done after the period of music, and the songs on the second side of Adam Hart Mother certainly don't go together. Same with Metal. Like, you've got the first side, which is very misshapen, bit of a dog's breakfast all over the shop. It's got Saint-Tropez, Waters, jazzy late night cocktail hour song, which can probably be thrown away forever, and the song with the dog singing, and then Echoes, which is very coherent. So if Metal was just Echoes, that would be a proper album, maybe a concept album. And Obscured by Clouds, again, although it was a soundtrack album, was very much just a collection of pop songs, rock songs, very FM radio friendly. So they're getting into that sound where they're getting much kind of nearer to mainstream radio, which was incredibly important in the 70s. So, Dark Side of the Moon, they kept going that way. And again, you could say maybe musically the songs don't all cohere together, but I would think they probably do. So with the reprise of Breathe, the whole, but it is a lyrical connection, and Roger Waters does need to get the credit for that, even though yeah, he's overstated his his importance in Pink Floyd. So, and also Alan Parsons was the engineer on this. That's something that needs to be brought up. But the most, I guess, the other big elements that broke them into the mainstream were the use of backing singers, female kind of backing singers in this album, on this album. It gave it a much more radio-friendly sound. Even though Gilmour did have a good voice, it's just Waters didn't particularly, and they were very much not going to break into the mainstream with songs like Set the Controls to the Heart of the Sun or Careful with That Axe, Eugene, or even Echoes. You can't do a drive time with a 20-minute song. Bob Dylan's just brought out a 17-minute song, so what do I know? It went to #1 too. Times have changed, but not in 1973. So they've got the backing singers, they've tightened up their sound, made the productions cleaner, more FM radio friendly. But yeah, the big thing is Roger Waters drawing together all these elements, ideas about the pressures and anxieties that come about through living through modern life, especially after the euphoria and the dreams of the counterculture in the 60s kind of crashed. They all came down to earth after Altamont. So Pink Floyd were really part of that huge surge and rush and euphoria of the mid to late 60s. And then they struggled on in some ways. But they really kind of encapsulate that period, going from the joy and the beautiful clothes, this sort of business from 1967 to they basically started wearing what a girlfriend at the time I saw when I was getting into Pink Floyd said they looked like they'd just been sleeping in a miniskip. So yeah, Roger Waters just got obsessed with a black Bonds t-shirt, black jeans and black boots, and Gilmour really just wore shirts that you now still see in the op shop with kind of, numbers on them, and to very, very 70s kind of look. And Rick Wright also wore what can only be described as secondhand basement clothes. So, and Mason even worse, out misshapen singlets. And anyway, that they dressed so well in the 60s, so some of us were disappointed, but hey, they were reflecting top down. They were reflecting the culture around them. So they were true to their own. They certainly didn't dress like Brian Ferry though. So okay, we've got this incredible cohesion of lyrics about the anxieties and pressures of modern life, and this can be connected back to sociologists who also talked about the disenchantment of modern life and the pressures and anxiety and the increase in mental illness that has occurred due to the industrialization and the rationalization of the workforce and society as a whole. So we're all forced into these jobs that only last until further notice. We're told to be at a certain place at a certain time, which was very, very modern understanding of time. Time before that had been very elusive, very infinite, even eternal. Certainly able to, you could say you'd be somewhere around sundown. I know I used to say that when I lived in the pre-modern years. I'll see you at sundown. And Jesus famously turned up to resurrect Lazarus late because he took a day to get there. Didn't matter. Time didn't matter. Still resurrected him, but he could have healed him without the resurrection. So time back then, not so important. But now, since the advent of trains, train stations especially, trains and train stations, when trains were being built all around Europe and then moving into Russia and so on, and even India, the time became very finite. Time became very structured and regulated. So if a train was going to appear at this station at this time, then from that, the people started going, okay, we've got to be there at 2 o'clock, 1:15, 1:20, 1:22. Very definitive, very specific, very specific. So this is a complete change of mentality. Blame the trains, and then it's swept out from trains, train station timetables into the greater culture, into greater society. So people started, instead of just working till sunrise to sunset, they would be working at particular times. And the Industrial Revolution, of course, occurred at the same time and made things even worse, because machines don't stop. They go all night, and the advent of electricity, we can keep people working around the clock. And of course, all the terrible things that happened in that Marx and other sociologists and theorists and activists were complaining about was the exploitation of child labour, making children work incredible hours. So normally everyone would kind of have to stop working at sunset. Think about this, it's interesting. So, and now we have to work around the clock. And the idea of the clock and time being finite and alarming, and the bings and bells of modern life, is very much on Dark Side of the Moon, specifically, I guess, on the track time that starts off with all these antique clocks going off, and then maybe the antique clocks of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the rationalisation and modernisation of Europe. Those clocks would have existed, and then we end up with the atomic clock that can measure time exactly to the millisecond. But you've got to reflect sometimes and go back to most of the human, conscious human existence on Earth certainly wasn't regulated in the way that our time has been for the last 500, 400 years. So huge change, and getting more and more overwhelming as we go. It's not slackening off in any way. So yes, Dark Side of the Moon, Roger Waters is tapping into that kind of territory. So the idea that the more regulated, the more rationalized that we become, the more anxious we become. And the idea of not only rationalization and even specialization, our jobs are all being broken down into competent parts rather than doing one great job, one person making a shoe, for instance, or a car. A car, obviously cars didn't exist pre-modern times, but a house, you'd have a whole lot of different people contracted to make that house. So Marx talked about that as bringing about a state of alienation of the workers, because they no longer had that sense of pride in their product, where they were the ones who created the whole thing, like a person who created a cathedral. Some people worked on cathedrals, that's maybe contradictory, but for their whole life, and then the next generation, the father would also work on that cathedral. So, but there definitely was a sense that one person would build something, so that they weren't alienated from their product in that it was made by many different people, and therefore they felt no connection to the product. If they only put the heel on a shoe or one wheel on a car, on a production line, the sense of pride when that car came out would be less so than if they built the car from scratch. So there's that element. And the workforce in the early 70s was certainly beginning to be weighed down by these aspects of modernity. So Waters is kind of tapping into that. So the first track, breathe in the air, don't forget to care. Leave, don't leave me, stick around and choose your own ground. So run, rabbit, run, dig that hole, forget the sun, and when at last the work is done, don't sit down, it's time to take another one. The idea of constant Protestant work ethic, the workaholic nature that's embedded into capitalism that Weber so beautifully and poignantly wrote about, is the idea that, that religious ethic of not being able to relax, not being able to constantly be working, because if you relaxed back then, the Calvinist ethic or ethos was that you wouldn't be one of the elect, or you were unlikely to be one of the elect. I'm not going to go into all that, it's incredibly complicated, but the idea that the elect is going on to the next life, having a place in heaven, and the elect, to not be one of the elect, a sign of not being one of the elect was not to work. So Benjamin Franklin in America famously encapsulated the idea of time is money. So, and to sit idle for an hour is equivalent to throwing 20 shillings out the window, or whatever, 4 shillings out the window. So to actually be idle, to actually sit and enjoy an hour of respite from work is sinful. And that, Weber argued, has flowed into the capitalist spirit. So, or not flowed in, actually brought about the capitalist spirit. So, and certainly in the 70s, this spirit of consumer goods and capitalist, out of control capitalism was very much taking off. Concords, the era of Concords, and just bringing globalization was just starting to take off. So it was actually accelerating. So we might think now it's a million times worse, but even back in the 70s, early 70s, there would have been that feeling that this is actually corrosive, is detrimental to our lives. All that wonder of the 60s of smoking a joint, lying in a field and just taking in that brief respite after the Second World War with all the horrors and the post-war rations. This generation, the baby boomers, had this time to actually sit back and enjoy nature and go to university and not be killing people and reflect. And then the reflection was sort of snatched away in the early 70s. It's quick, let's get to work. The hippie dream was an illusion. Now we want to make lots of money, and people got into Microsoft, and all these people who rolled around in the field naked at Woodstock suddenly became great money makers in the Silicon Valley, California. So Waters was disenchanted with all of this. And also a major part of the album is not just the disenchantment of modern life, but the disenchantment of Syd Barrett, their great friend and founding member of the early albums, who had all the talent, all the, as I mentioned in my Syd Barrett post, all the direct connection to the unconscious. So it was very intuitive what he was doing, extremely intuitive, and gone, way too early. And so again, and he could symbolize to Waters, I'm sure he did, as being a sort of, as being a, what's the word, a casualty of modern life. They tried to fit him into the star-making machine, which we'll talk about on Wish You Were Here. But yeah, that idea that he didn't fit into modern life, he couldn't, certainly couldn't fit time frames and being at a certain place at a certain time. Hence, the band once turned up for a gig, or were driving to a gig, and they were meant to pick up Syd Barrett, and Waters or someone said, "Fuck him, let's just go," because they knew he wouldn't be ready, and he wouldn't be ready. Got to be on stage at 9 o'clock. The regulation, the rationalisation of music, and the commercialisation, the commodification, as Adorno, the theorist, talked about. So, yes, Waters very much went along with all of this because he desperately wanted to be popular and famous, but he was the practical one. He wanted to make money out of music, and as some of us know, it's extraordinarily hard, eh? Very hard. So he probably thought, we're onto a good thing if we just keep working away diligently in the afterglow of Syd Barrett, maybe people won't even notice that Syd's gone. Well, they certainly did, but incredible story of being able to carry on and reinvent the brand of Pink Floyd and be even more successful with it. So we've got all the dilemmas. We've got on one side Syd Barrett, the disintegration of the psyche of a man, beautiful man with all this talent and raw energy and good looks and charisma and connection into this kind of wonderful child-like ability to rhyme, and the poetic sensibility that's in his songs, that also encapsulates the 60s, that kind of glorious, colourful, walking out of the black and white post-war rations of the mid-60s into the multicolour of Sgt. Pepper and Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And then we're going away from that to this more kind of cynical age of the early 70s, where time is money is becoming much more prevalent and more embedded in the culture. So Waters is very much talking about that. And of course, the track time is probably one of my favourite tracks. It's starting off with the rototoms and just building, and then again, a huge element of this album is David Gilmour. And although he didn't write any songs, I think he got a credit on Any Colour You Like, the instrumental. He didn't write any of the songs on this album. his voice and guitar are just, you couldn't have the album without them. So he's crucial to the album. When people think of Pink Floyd, they think of his voice and his guitar, specifically probably from this album, with Money being on the radio all the time, which we'll talk about. But Time very much has a cracking, great Gilmour solo, double-tracked. Sky, very slow, just bending a few notes, but beautifully recorded. Classic sort of guitar sound of the early to mid-70s that unfortunately he abandoned around the time of The Wall and especially afterwards, and got, although the final cut has some great corrosive, abrasive solos on it, but he got this kind of awful, not edgy, but the edge, but that kind of 80s sound, Miami Vice sound, I call it, that kind of whoa, with the delay and the just, compression on it, which isn't on this album. This album, the guitar is very uncompressed and just very raw and very loud. Apparently, there's a thing on YouTube where Waters is recording him doing the solo off Time or Eclipse, I think, and Gilmour's going, where would rock and roll be without distortion? And Waters is trying to temper the distortion down. And again, that's another story about this album. Waters wanted a very dry, clean mix, and Gilmour wanted much more echo and more reverberation on reverb on this album. So they fought to the death about this, and I think they half and half got their way. Waters probably won back then, but there's a story about Comfortably Numb where they argued over that for about a year and a half, and eventually they compromised with half of the verses were dry and the choruses had echo on it, something like that. So Time is a classic kind of track, and again the lyrics are very poignant and apt for that time, ticking away the moments that make up a dull day, kicking around the ground in an offhand way, and the idea that the starting gun's gone and you're not ready. So every year's getting shorter, never seem to find the time, plans that either come to naught or half a page of scribbled lines, hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way, and the time is gone, the song is over, thought I had something more to say. So this idea that, time's ticking all the time, and the Benjamin Franklin Protestant work ethic, you've got to make use of time. Every hour that you sit idle is an hour wasted. So that Benjamin Franklin Protestant work ethic that infused capitalism and also the industry, the machine, the Industrial Revolution, the machine-like nature, lights being on all the time, 24 hours a day, capacity to work. Even bands can play, tour, get on Concords. If you're Phil Collins, you can do 2 gigs in a day. You can work harder than ever. So the workaholic nature of music is very interesting. Someone should write a thesis on that. But the people, the Phil Collins, the Roger Waters, the Nick Cave, the people who were workaholics tended to thrive in this atmosphere, and the ones who didn't, who were just more laid back, didn't. And Gilmour's very lucky that he had Waters and even Syd Barrett. Every band needed that driving force, the person who's going to crack the whip and say, no, let's not smoke bongs, let's fucking get on with it. So, yes, a great Rick Wright was also a bit of a stoner for all accounts. So Roger Waters is a driving force here. And the song Money is meant to be a kind of first track on side 2, a cynical look at the greedy nature of capitalism, but I think there's a bit of Roger Waters in there. Money, get back, I'm all right, Jack, keep your hands off my stack. New car, caviar, 4-star daydream, think I'll buy me a football team. Waters, certainly got swept up in the capitalist 70s, in the buying houses and obviously flying around. He, to give him his due, his father, before he got killed in the war, which we could talk about for 100 hours, but we're not going to because he already has. His father, and I think his mother was a big activist, and his father had communist leanings, socialist leanings. So Waters has always had an understanding or talked about the underclass and helping the poor, although Nick Mason recently in an interview with the two of them said that Waters was making a snide remark about Mason, because Mason was always wealthy even before Pink Floyd got good. Not that working class sort of kudos that you need to be in a band, but Mason was rich and got even more filthy rich, whereas Mason turned it back on Waters and said, well, you've been unable to share your wealth now. So who knows if that's true, or yeah, but Waters is certainly a very tyrannical and me, narcissistic, solipsistic sort of nature to Waters. So it wouldn't surprise me if he kept his cars locked firmly in his garage, his many cars. So yeah, Money, again, it's a great riff in 7/8 time, I think. Great riff. Roger Waters obviously wrote the bass line. Again, it's over familiarity with that song on the radio, so a lot of people. But again, it's an interesting message, a sarcastic, that you can take as being, there's an explicit meaning and an implicit meaning. So there's the, yeah, money, yeah, fuck yeah, America, yeah, yeah, and USA, and then there's, hang on a minute, this is sarcasm. Randy Newman's tried to walk that line of character songs where somebody's using sarcasm or using a character to write about a point of view, and it gets lost on the audience. Money for Nothing, Mark Knopfler. Again, written about a character in a TV shop making comments about the rock industry, MTV. And of course, people think Mark Knopfler's talking from his own voice. But certainly Money, a lot of people take that as literal. Money, it's a gas. I'm all right, Jack, keep your hands off my stack. Yeah, you know. So, which again, a cracking great guitar solo in that with a beautiful guitar sound, and Gilmour's lyric vocals very much prominent in that. So, and again, the track on side one that I absolutely love that is a bit divisive, but On the Run, which there's a clip of them working on this in the incredible Live at Pompeii film. And Waters is the one, of course, running the synthesizer, this really old piece of machinery to get that running sound of anxiety and constant motion, momentum that I talked about in Capitalist Spirit, the constant 24-hour, 7 days a week momentum. So there's that element to it that music conjures up through the synthesizers. And there's a sound of a man, a businessman running through a tunnel, a train tunnel, it sounds like. So that's a great track. Doesn't have a melody, it doesn't have a chorus or even any lyrics, but I think it works really well on the first side, and again adds to the feeling that this album is pushing the boundaries with which Pink Floyd was seen to be doing at that time, mixing electronic equipment, electronic ideas and synthesizers way early, before it became very fashionable, in with standard kind of electric bass drums guitar that we're used to, or people were used to back then. So certainly incredibly innovative from their time, and they were on the first album, and they continued. Every album is just more innovation. So one of the most innovative bands of all time, and a lot of people would try and argue with that, but good luck. Anyway, Us and Them is After Money on the second side. You've heard that a billion times. To me, it's funny, I listened back to this album on vinyl recently, and it's just so beautifully recorded. The bass and drums are just so clear. It's almost like a textbook example of what a 70s sounding bass and drum sound should be. And Mason was obviously influenced by Ringo Starr's drum tom-tom fills on Sgt. Pepper's, but he really did make it his own kind of sound, and his drum fills just very much a big part of this, especially in Money and the jam session of Time. Boom. Very unique to Pink Floyd of that time, but they've almost become a cliche now. But this is where they kind of got to be known, well known. So that sound is really good. Again, all in the space, the vocals are very dry, recorded really dryly, which they started doing in Obscured by Clouds, that Gilmour sound. Gilmour just had this wonderful FM radio friendly, clear, very distinctively English sound, not so much as Syd Barrett with his English tones to his voice, but it's still very English, quintessentially English, the way he phrases some of these lines. After all, we're only, I'm not going to try and imitate that. Yeah, but in the end, it's only around, haven't you heard, it's a battle of words, us and them, and after all, we're only ordinary men. It's not ordinary man. So yeah, the English sensibility of Barrett, Gilmour kind of keeps it up, but it's not as distinct, as not as idiosyncratic and original, or as noticeable as Syd Barrett. But Us and Them very much, to me, is the only track on this album that was recorded poorly. Maybe they had a different producer for that track. It just seems to be very cluttered when they get to the chorus, and compressed, and Forward He Cried. And again, the lyrics there are not my favourite, because it's kind of making a pointed attack on capitalism, us and them. Heaven knows, God knows, it's not what we would choose to do. And when they played it live, they had a film of businessmen all walking up and down Wall Street or somewhere in their white shirts and blue suits, and all looking the same. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously a cynical view of business people, which is fine and fair enough. But hey, not all of us can be pop stars, but I totally get the critique. But yeah, the chorus kind of goes off into the war again, like Corporal Clegg. And to me, it's not very convincing. Forward He Cried, the general sat and the lines on the map moved from side to side. That doesn't, to me, cohere with the rest of the song, which is about capitalism. Anyway, Waters just loved talking about the war, and it was only going to get worse. Like, it was restrained on these early albums, so it's only going to get worse. But still, beautiful Rick Wright song with the wonderful piano on it. And yeah, let's talk about Rick Wright, because he wrote 2 songs on this album, Us and Them, and of course The Great Gig in the Sky, which, what a segue, is again, originally was recorded around the time of Moore, I think. Oh no, Zabriskie Point. I think that would, and they knocked it back, the producer knocked it back. Big mistake. So you can hear the early version on the early year box set, just the instrumental. But Waters, being Waters, saw it and thought, I can use that, and wrote a lyric over the top. And yeah, it's easily, over familiarity has kind of dampened my love of it, but it's still a great, that kind of spacey guitar finger picking, and just the space of Pink Floyd, which again, I talked about space on my AC/DC reviews, but don't clutter up the whole sound. Just a lot of space on Pink Floyd, partly due to Nick Mason. I seem to look over that side of the screen a lot. I don't know why. There's a beautiful panorama of trees out there, so I'm looking out at trees. But yeah, talking of space, there's Nick Mason, has been criticised a lot for his drumming, but when he actually goes for a fill, he stops using the foot drum. So he kind of boom, and then back with the foot drum and the hi-hat and all the ride cymbal. So it gives it, there's a lot of space, and Gilmour's use of echo, and it's just not cluttered. There's no rhythm guitar a lot of the time, or it's just Gilmour, so they haven't got 2 guitars. So it's a very clean album, which another reason why it became such a big seller. I think a lot of people wanted to show off their hi-fi systems to their friends, and this was deemed to be one of the great, well-recorded albums, so a lot of people bought it for that. So you've got the incredible cover, you've got the topical lyrics, you've got the concept album, you've got Gilmour's voice and guitar, you've got the backing singers making a kind of nice radio-friendly sound, and then on top of that, you've also got the space and the way it's recorded, showing off people's hi-fi systems. So many people will be buying this album for different reasons. That's how you make a million seller. Follow my prescription here, and I might knock one of these up this afternoon. Whew. So, yes, Us and Them. Just sounds a bit murky to me, but don't know why that is. And of course, it segues into the next song, Any Colour You Like, which is the only instrumental. Well, you've got the On the Run too, but again, I never used to really like this song. I thought it was a one-week musical moment of the album, but I've grown to like it. I think Rick Wright's synthesizers on it are really cool, and kind of really deep-toned, dark, kind of bassy sounds that he used on Obscured by Clouds on the opening track are on that track. And Gilmour's got this guitar sound, kind of a electric wah sound. I've got that pedal somewhere buried in my garage, but not a big fan of that sound, but he makes it kind of work, and it just segues really nicely into the last suite of songs. But we were talking about Gig in the Grass. So, yeah, again, it was used originally for a soundtrack, and then they reworked it, adding the incredible voice of Clare. Let me get her name right. Clare somebody. Clare Torry, yes, and famously she got paid a set wage for it, because who would have known this album would be so popular? And then Rick Wright rather reluctantly gave her songwriting credit later on in the 2000s, I think, before he died. So it's an interesting argument, that one, because the chords were already there, but Clare Torry's vocal could be deemed to be a melody in itself. Well, she provided one of the main melodies on the song, so that should have added to it. But a lot of arguments in bands are like a guy comes in or a girl comes in and plays a song, and then you've got the basic structure, the chords of the song, and then someone adds an element to the song that's very distinctive. Neil Young's talked about this, even a hook at the beginning of the song, but they didn't write the chords, so they don't get the credit. A hook doesn't give you a credit. Mike Loves followed this line. Of course, he was arguing for more money for himself, but at the end of Wouldn't It Be Nice has a line where Mike Love goes, "Good night, oh baby, sleep tight, oh baby," which you just think is a minor little icing on the cake of all the incredible elements of that song that have already been put down, but he got 50% of that. And Sting on Money for Nothing, I Want My MTV, which he added to the song because they were recording in the same studio in Montsalvat, the Police recording at the same time, maybe Ghost in the Machine or Synchronicity. And yeah, or maybe a solo album. A solo album, actually, for Dream of the Blue Turtles, he was recording at the same time as Brothers in Arms. So they saw Sting windsurfing and asked him to do the... So he came in, sung I Want My MTV, which is the same melody as Don't Stand So Close to Me. Don't stand so close to me. I want my MTV. And I think he got 50% of Money for Nothing, which could buy you not just one small Caribbean island, but could buy you a third world country. Unbelievable. Terrible. Just for that line. So Clare Torry eventually did get some money for singing that incredible screeching, but not all screeching, singing solo vocal on that track. And again, it's apparently the most played song for people having sex is Great Gig in the Sky, because it builds and builds and has the climax, and then there's kind of the afterglow at the end where she's moaning at the end. That might be some people's sexual experience, but in the 70s, that was the #1 track to play. So, yes, there you go, another informative fact that you've got there. So, Great Gig in the Sky, 2 Rick Wright tracks. Then we have the suite of songs at the end, just finishing up here. So, Brain Damage and Eclipse. Not that I need to look, but I'm being... So, Brain Damage is really a well-constructed song. Again, very much haunted by the spectre of Syd Barrett. The lunatic is on the grass, the lunatic is on the grass. Very English too, very English. Again, some of Waters' lyrics are poetic. It's not just Syd Barrett. What is it? Remembering games and daisy chains and laughs, got to keep the loonies on the path. And then, of course, the idea that, and if the band you're in starts playing different tunes, we'll see you on the dark side of the moon. Very much alluding to Syd Barrett playing just one chord the whole way through their sets in the late 1967 and driving the band bananas. So the finger-picking guitar on this is excellent by Gilmour, and the synth and the whole sound of this, it's easily probably one of my favourites on this. And I think it's really poignant having that song at the end of all the anxiety and the things that drive modern people insane, and the anxieties and the pressures of capitalism and the work ethic and the Industrial Revolution and the 24/7 workaholic nature of not just our own sensibility, but the structure, the institutions, the buildings, the electric light that just gives us the ability to feed into our workaholic nature. Imagine if it just went dark at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, no one could work. But now, yeah, it's like the coronavirus, which is happening right now as we speak. I'm an introvert, and then coronavirus happens, and it just feeds in. It's like I'm a kid in a candy shop. It's like, don't have to do anything, just stay here talking to myself, talking to a screen. So yeah, the capitalist ethos that came from Protestant religion, workaholic Benjamin Franklin, you could argue this, fed into the material world, the modes of production that Marx would call it. They were already there, and just they exacerbated each other. Both these things, the work ethic exacerbated or enhanced, you could argue, the industry, the material machines and lights and innovations that have made it possible to work around the clock. So workaholics are just loving the early 70s, and they're even loving now even more, although they're probably not liking the coronavirus. So Brain Damage segues into Eclipse, the last track, which again is just a series of one-liners, you could say, not a proper song, but it's not on the level of Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire. Not just cataloguing a whole lot of incidents and calling the song. But yeah, so all that you touch, all that you see, all that you taste, all that you feel, everything under the sun is in tune, but the sun is eclipsed by the moon. Some people could say this is quasi-philosophical nonsense, but it's not dissimilar to the Beatles' last line on Abbey Road. And in the end, the love you make is equal to the love you take is equal to the love you make. So, yeah, they were opposite the corridor from the Beatles, so influences obviously from the Beatles. So everything under the sun is in tune. The sun is eclipsed by the moon, obviously maybe referring to the fact that the madness and the internal anxieties and our unconscious forces will always break out of the darkness into the sunlight. So we can be all in tune, like the Apollinian. Nietzsche talked about the Apollinian state of order, that we try and fit over the top of the chaos, over the Dionysian unconscious driving forces that overwhelm us, that are still there, that we think we're in control of. And yeah, everything's in tune under the sun. During the day, you feel like life's under control. And then, but the sun is eclipsed by the moon. And the moon breaking over the sun during the days really messes with people's minds, because it shows that we're not, the uncanny is still there, and the day is not always in tune and formatted and conscious and ordered and structured and regulated, that sometimes the dark forces from the night, the mystery of the night, and I won't say the feminine, but the idea of the chaotic nature of the night. Little Red Riding Hood, going to the forest. Darkness still happens, even though, God, we've got our premiers and people saying, we've had enough of this, we're going to get rid of murder, get rid of rape, get rid of everything, because we said so, and we're going to... But darkness is there forever in human nature, and no amount of shining a light on it's going to get rid of it. It's always going to come up. And hence, the last thing is always eclipsed by the moon. So certainly eclipsed Syd Barrett, and again eclipsed the band eventually, because they really kind of lost it after. They didn't lose it. They made some great albums after this, which I'll talk about. But yes, this is certainly their biggest selling album. And in this particular version, there's all sorts of ephemera, pictures of pyramids and pictures of the band, I think, even, and getting rather hot in this big coat. And the CD version, the recent CD version, had an extra CD with a live tracks on it, which is worth hearing. Here it is. So that's off the Discovery box, or not. It's came out at the same time. Mixed in 2011 by Andy Jackson. So that's the live album. So it's them live at Wembley. To me, it's not special. Unfortunately, they didn't record any great concerts of them doing Dark Side, well, at least with visuals to them. So you really only need the album. It's an experience. It's one of the most popular albums of all time. But yeah, there's a lot to it. I think the themes of anxiety and the pressures of modern life and the inability to people to relax is still very prevalent in this day and age. So I think it still has a lot to say to us now, even though some of the songs have been overplayed. And it certainly shows that trajectory from the optimism and joy and uplift of the post-war 60s counterculture to the commercialization and commodification of life and culture that happened in the 70s, where money became bigger and bigger and more important, and people stopped rolling around in fields and started working for, as I said, Silicon Valley, and making big bucks on Wall Street. And then we get into the 80s where things get even worse. So Pink Floyd, you can follow their career and map out the way that culture developed from the 60s through the 70s to the horror of the 80s, which very much encapsulated Pink Floyd with Radio Chaos and Momentary Lapse of Reason, but that's for another time. So I'm going to wind up. This is meant to be short, but it's gone on a bit. But I hope that helps. And next time we're going to Wish You Were Here, which is again another amazing album, but very different from Dark Side of the Moon, because they kept producing new masterpieces or innovating. They kept innovating. So goodbye from me. I'm going to give you a final glance at this coat. The death of the 60s. So I'm going to show you right now the change from Pipe at the Gates of Dawn to the horrors of the 70s. Okay, so we've got the multicolour, counterculture, freedom, infinite horizons, post-war. We're moving out into the freaky, taking lots of drugs and enjoying ourselves, to, look at this. This wasn't planned, by the way. Commercialism. And this is the kind of top that David Gilmour would wear throughout the 70s. And still you find in bargain shops and so on. Like a product placement and just a kind of rudimentary type of t-shirt. So we've gone into the 70s now with Pink Floyd. The coat's gone. From now on, we're going to be immersed in the end of the counterculture and the beginning of the capitalist kind of money-orientated, commodified ethos that still, and work ethic that still runs today. So goodbye to you, and I will see you on the other side of the moon with Wish You Were Here. That was tragic. Anyway, Wish You Were Here up next. Ta-ta.